Now, throughout the coronavirus pandemic, we're trying to answer as many of your questions as we can here on Good Morning Scotland. This morning, in the latest of our Ask GMS series, we're joined by the employment lawyer and partner at Thompsons Solicitors. Good morning to you both.
Hello. Good.
And I should also mention that we've already had lots of your questions in for them, but there's still loads of time to get in touch. So please do text on 80295, email goodmorningscotland@bbc.co.uk, or use the hashtag AskBBCGMS on social media. David, what have you been hearing then in terms of the concerns people have from the legal standpoint?
I think one of the biggest issues we've heard about is in relation to the government's furlough scheme, which should be, and we anticipate being, one of the biggest positive government interventions at this time, and which will help address all of the personal finance issues that Iona was talking about. The main issue with that scheme is that it's not actually up and running yet. So we're seeing the scheme, we hope, introduced as of Monday, which is when employers will be able to make the application for a grant on behalf of all of their employees. But we haven't actually seen that happen yet. So one of the difficulties that employers are facing, and this is obviously a knock-on effect for employees, is that they have real cash flow issues. I mean, they have been shut down, they've not been able to trade for many, many weeks, and will not be able to trade for many, many weeks or months to come, but they don't have any sort of income to pay their staff yet. So we've seen many employers dismiss employees, make them redundant, and despite the promises from the government, we haven't actually seen any hard cash. So one of the difficulties is, first of all, lack of hard cash, and I think secondly, probably for a lot of employers, confusion about what they can and can't claim for, which is preventing them engaging with the government's job retention scheme.
Yeah, and on that, there is some confusion from businesses. I mean, in my normal job in this programme, I speak to a lot of businesses about the furlough scheme, and there is some uncertainty there. I mean, do we know who exactly is eligible for this scheme and who's going to miss out?
So it should be, it is designed to be the widest possible net that is cast. It's effectively everybody who is paid under PAYE who was employed as at, and they've just moved the date forward, the 19th of March. So the government actually, in response to a lot of pressure from campaign groups, which, trade unions and others have done an excellent job in bringing the date forward to the 19th of March when people can be included in the scheme. So it's a very wide group of people. It includes those who are on 0 hours contracts, for example, who are often excluded from these schemes. But again, we have, there is lack of clarity on a couple of key issues. And I think that is preventing employers paying out in the first instance, but also actually knowing what they need to pay out on and what they can pay out on. For example, questions like someone who regularly works overtime, is that overtime something they can claim back for the government? Because if they don't know that, then they're not going to pay out to their staff when they put them on furlough for the overtime, because they're going to be worried about whether they can actually eventually reclaim that from the government. There's other questions around sick pay, for example, and what the status of people on sick pay is, and continuing lack of clarity around holidays and what people do about holidays. So all of these things are preventing employers engaging with this scheme, which I think everybody would agree is an incredibly positive move from the Chancellor, but it just needs that clarity to really get it off the ground.
And David, a lot of questions about actually what staff are entitled to when they're on furlough. So we've had an email from Antonio who wants to ask about holiday entitlement during furlough. So he asks, will we still have 28 days for a full-time job? And during furlough, can you accrue any holiday entitlement?
So this is something which employment lawyers have been desperately asking the government to clarify for the last 3 weeks. We had the final version of the scheme, or we think the final version of the scheme on the 15th, so a couple of days ago, and I'm afraid there was no clarification on holidays at all. So unfortunately, this may be something which effectively the courts will just have to decide. If you were to ask me what I would suggest employers should do, is approach this on the basis that these individuals still remain employed. As a result, they continue to accrue a holiday entitlement. So I would suggest it's pretty clear that they're going to continue to accrue holidays. Now, an interesting question arises as to whether an employer can force an employee to take a period of annual leave. so that as long as they give them double the notice of the length of holiday they're going to take, then they can force them to take annual leave. So a lot of employers we've seen have said to people, for example, you are obliged to take your own, to take a certain proportion of your annual leave before, say, the end of June or July this year, to make sure that people are using holidays even when they're on furlough. Interesting questions arise from that because it's not much of a holiday, and I think everyone just needs to accept that. Being on annual leave during a period of lockdown is not people's normal understanding of what a holiday is. I think the law would probably say as long as it is a period of, in inverted commas, rest and relaxation, then it probably would still fall under the definition of holiday.
Yeah, and David, one of the things that we're continually told actually by people who are in the process, and Iona mentioned it there, when people are applying for things, is there's an element of chaos around, even in the government departments, don't always necessarily know what stage anything is at.
No, I think we've seen that in relation to all of the business loans, for example, that have been applied for a number of grants. And HMRC are very, very clear, particularly in relation to the job retention scheme and the claims that employers are going to make. They have been absolutely clear that they do not want anyone phoning HMRC at this time. Everything needs to be done online. And I think we've heard reports of people waiting 3, 4, 5, 6 hours on the phone trying to get through when they have individual queries. So significant delays. I mean, that is, we have to be clear. HMRC and all government departments are going through exactly the same issues as every other workplace. They will have significant numbers of people who are off work, who are self-isolating, who are shielding. So this is a kind of perfect storm where we have entirely new systems of government and benefits being introduced at the same time as those who are trying to implement those processes have huge staffing issues. So yes, there will be delays, and I think with a lot of things at this time, we just all have to kind of take a deep breath and be sort of considerate towards those who are trying to provide these services.
But it can be very confusing, can't it, David? And as you've pointed out, there are different categories that people are in. They're shielding, or they're social distancing, or they're isolating at home. Paul Nichol emailed on just this subject. He says, I'm currently furloughed, but also shielding a family member in the vulnerable category. If my company returns to work before the 12-week shielding period is over, what's my position with regard to employment? Can they lay me off, leave me on furlough, or is there any other mechanism, he asks, which the government has announced? Because there are a number of different things that they've announced, and at different times. Yeah. And of course, this 12-week period almost doubles what we're getting. We've had 3-4 weeks of lockdown and another 3 weeks. Yeah. So it's almost double.
Yeah, I mean, I think the government has been explicit in relation to the shielding and furlough. So what they've said is that you can put somebody on furlough for the purposes of that person shielding. Now, it is not clear whether that would be extended to for the purposes of shielding another individual within that household. I don't think there's anything explicit on that. But what the guidance that came out a couple of days ago was very clear about is that the purposes for which you can furlough someone are extremely broad. It is for any purpose related to coronavirus or coronavirus disease. So I think that cast the net very, very wide and would certainly allow an employer who was minded to do so to claim a grant in respect of furlough for that individual if they were wanting to stay home for the purposes of shielding a family member. However, we need to remember that this is effectively an employer-administered social benefit, and it is pretty much up to the employer in most cases whether they want to choose to apply for the grant. So it's possibly one of the strengths of the scheme that it's being administered by employers, but possibly also one of the weaknesses because employers do not have the same kind of social objectives as the government probably has. They have much more selfish objectives in terms of their business. So if this individual is a really key employee and the employer wants them to return to work as soon as their business starts up, they may just say to that employee, we can't afford not to have you at work, and therefore we're not going to continue to put you on furlough. It's one of the difficulties with the scheme that effectively employees don't really have any say as to whether they should be furloughed or not. It's just a question for employers.
I also wanted to asked a question about the extra £20 a week. So we've had a text from Colin, who both of you might be able to answer this. But when will I'm just going to ask you. I'm just going to ask you a different question instead. So we've had another text asking: is an employer allowed to impose a salary reduction while working from home?
So this is a really good question, and I think the use of the word impose is really important here, because what imposing suggests is that this wasn't reached by agreement. This was just something which the employer said, I am going to reduce your salary. Now, as a matter of contract, that's not something an employer can do. There has to be an agreement reached if there's going to be a reduction in salary. What we think a lot of employers have done is just write out to staff and say, we have decided you're being furloughed and we have decided that you are going to have a salary reduction of 20%. Now, interestingly, the scheme which was produced a couple of days ago made it very clear that that wasn't good enough. You could not just notify employees that their salary had been reduced. You had to have express agreement from the employee that their salary was going to be reduced, and that had to be in writing, so that could be done by email. And really all that involves is an exchange of emails which says, look, I am proposing to put you onto the furlough scheme to reduce your salary by 20%, and the employee coming back and saying, I agree to that proposal, and that would be enough for an agreement to be reached. But an imposition of a salary reduction is not going to be good enough as a matter of contract, and it's also not going to be good enough for the employer to apply for the grant. So they need to be much more careful about how they do that. The reality of the situation, though, is that most employees are going to accept that reduction. And the reason for that is because the alternatives are likely to be unpaid leave or redundancy consultation.
There's an extraordinary one, talking of reductions. There's an extraordinary one from Grant, who's texted in on 80295. Says, my wife's a dental nurse. Due to the practice being 85% NHS and 15% private, her employer has said she'll only be due 15% of the furlough scheme. Is that correct? And is there any sign the government's supporting the dental industry further? I don't know, Iona, if you've got a thought on that.
No, I think I'm going to leave that one to David, to be honest, because that sounds like the intricacies of employment law, which is not my speciality.
No,
well, it's down to this split between NHS and private.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there was some suggestion in the initial government guidance saying that publicly funded organisations were not, and it wasn't anticipated that they would make use of the scheme. But it's been very clear in the sort of legal documents that publicly funded organisations, such as, if they're 85% funded by the NHS, they are perfectly entitled to make use of the coronavirus job retention scheme in its fullest operation. So I can't see any reason why you would only receive, why it would be split by percentage. The income of the practice is very likely to just be an amalgamated income for the whole practice. So I don't see how it's valid to split that when it comes to employee salaries.
It sounds like they've got some words to be had with that practice.